Morrison.
It's a really good chance to explain the process. There is a Prime Minister right now, and that's Scott Morrison, and there's a Prime Minister the day after the election, regardless of the result, and that's Scott Morrison. He's the one who has to go down the road to the Governor-General and say he can or can't form a majority government. If he can't, obviously he scratches around to try and form one, so he'll be ringing around, we're assuming a crossbench in those circumstances. And so the only question is, would I take his phone call? Yes, of course I would, and we'd have a discussion about the possibilities of how a parliament could run for 3 years or not.
Look, after the last time this happened and you were a kingmaker, you did, of course, swing your support behind Julia Gillard, and this has been used against you by the Conservative side of politics. Would you do that again? I mean, the Conservative side of politics says that effectively a vote for you is a vote for Labor.
Oh, really? I mean, who cares what they say? And it's actually a Queenmaker. It was Australia's first female Prime Minister. Look, the process is there is a Prime Minister now. It is Scott Morrison. There'll be a Prime Minister directly after the election, even if it is a wipeout election, and we're assuming hypotheticals here, also assuming that this tough contest in the seat of Cowper, that I am elected, and I'm certainly not assuming that. But to answer your question, I would take a phone call from Scott Morrison. We would have a discussion and try and work out how Parliament would work. If we can't reach agreement, you try and find an alternative who can make a majority on the floor of the Parliament. This isn't just a question for one member of Parliament. This is a question for 150 members of Parliament to try and work out how best to represent the vote that had just taken place on the 18th of May, but basically starting from today.
In 2016, you claimed 26% of the primary vote against the sitting Nationals MP, Luke Houtzaker. Now he's retiring. Do you now expect to win? Because obviously the benefit of incumbency is lost.
I can tell you there's no expectations. We're going as hard as we can. I think there's some lessons learned from the campaign in 2016. I did a very much a minute to midnight campaign over 3 weeks. I think I put the nomination form in only minutes before nominations closed and pulled together infrastructure from there. We were sitting around a kitchen table and trying to work it out as we went. I'm sure you recall, in amongst all the elections, that one was one with a difference. We didn't win, and you quite often learn more lessons from the ones you lose than the ones you win. We've started early. We've built a big network of supporters and volunteers. They're very active on the ground, but I can't predict how effective that is and just how deep that's running throughout the community. I do know there's a lot of frustration with the 6 years of a government that's failed to deliver on the reasons it was elected, including stable government and keeping prime ministers, including energy and environmental policy, which is non-existent. So there's frustration on the ground. We've built a big network. There is a mood for change. Whether it's enough, we'll find out over the coming weeks.
The Nationals candidate for the seat says you are not making clear your view on Labor's franking credit policy. Given it will affect self-funded retirees in the seat of Cowper, what is your view? Do you support the policy?
No, I've been very clear, and that's obviously the game that's going on. I am very cautious of Labor policies, although I've got to say I'm not following them that closely. Again, if elected, there was a good institution that was built through that 2010 period that you talked about, called the Parliamentary Budget Office, where you can get good financial advice on all the costings of all election policies. So my plan is, if elected, to whoever is the government of the day to run all their policies through that process, and we can start to separate truth from fiction, and we can start to work out what is the strategy over the following 3 years. So I'm very cautious of the franking credit policy.
Cautious is not being against it, though, is it?
North Coast.
Cautious is not being against it, though.
Sorry?
Being cautious is not saying you're against it.
Yeah, it is being well, I am, based on what I have seen, I am against it. But I'm very cautious of picking a couple of issues off the tax shelf and calling it tax reform. From my point of view, and you can go back in history, I've been consistent that I think Australia does need comprehensive tax reform that neither of the major parties have really laid out the path for 5 years, 10 years of progressive tax reform in this country, because the economy is changing. And I can give you some very real examples of this on the ground. Only yesterday, and please don't laugh, I was sitting in a hairdresser's shop talking to the owner, not getting a haircut, about how he's training up apprentices basically to go into competition with him because they're all going out, not paying GST and working from home. Likewise, the way people purchase their retail products from overseas now is changing the way main streets can operate. So there is a desperate need for structural reform. This isn't cyclical as far as the way the tax system is changing. And both major parties seem to be ignoring this and hurting regional small business along the way.
So you're against Labor's franking credits policy. Are you also opposed to Labor's changes to negative gearing?
Yeah, look, I'm saying I'm very cautious because I haven't gone through them in detail, because I don't think, from my point of view, from my campaign of working throughout the local area, they're my top priority of issues of why I'm standing for Parliament. I'm not standing for Labor. So if elected, I'll have a look at whoever's the government of the day and work through those issues with them. But I'm very cautious of anyone who's just picking tax issues off the shelf and trying to call that comprehensive tax reform. I don't think that's good for the mid-north coast, and it's up to really Labor to sell them harder than what they are. There's a lot of nervousness about those issues in this region, and I respond very much to that nervousness.
So at this stage, would you vote against those two signature policies? They've been out for a long time. You say you're not noticing, but really they have been out for a long time. Would you vote against those policies if they were put before the Parliament?
Yeah, we're playing a double hypothetical of A, getting elected, and B, Bill Shorten and the Labor Party getting elected. And also C, you're sending me into territory which is pretty much unfair on any candidate to take a position on legislation you haven't seen. So in general, that is why I use the words cautious. It would be unlikely I would support it, but show me a piece of legislation and I'll give you a more definitive answer.
Okay. Labor are preferencing you first and the Greens second. Have you made any agreements with Labor in exchange for their preferences?
Not at all. In fact, we came out first and said we are not preferencing anyone and we're not doing any preference deals at all. There's a danger in that, particularly in New South Wales, so close to the state election, where with non-compulsory preferential voting, people can just vote one and walk out. So we're working very hard to try and encourage as many people as possible to mark every box in any order you want. There's 8 candidates here, and obviously we're pushing as hard as we can to get a vote one for Rob Oakeshott.
Last time you were in office, you voted to support the Gillard government's carbon policies. What do you make of Labor's climate change policy this time round?
Well, I would say on the contrary, it was Tony Windsor and I who forced the government, and both sides had the choice to actually get on and develop that multi-party climate change committee and get on with embedding climate change into the processes of government. And at the time we did have world-leading legislation. I concede we lost control of the politics, and that Tony Abbott, as the alternate Prime Minister, came in on a wave of that carbon tax message, which even his Chief of Staff, after the event has admitted was more about the politics than anything to do with policy. So I am very much still in the consistent position of what major businesses and what most Australians, I think, are coming to the position of is we want certainty on this topic, and so we can move on to the many other issues that we need to deal with as a country. But even as of yesterday at the Coffs Harbour Jetty Markets, the National Party candidate who I'm up against, when asked by a local gentleman, do you believe in man-made climate change? He gave the answer yes and no. So these, we've got to get beyond this, is it real, is it not, and just get on with delivering the certainty into all aspects of government, and also give that certainty for the private sector. This should be good industry policy for the future and not necessarily about environmental policy. And I think I'm closer to the likes of a BHP, Woodside and a Glencore when I say that, than both of the major parties are, who are being pretty shy about the leadership needed on this really important topic for the future of the country.
Rob Oakeshott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
That's independent candidate for Cowper, Rob Oakeshott.